Okay, well, welcome everybody. Can you give me a thumbs up, Damian, if you can hear me? Or Esther? Yep, perfect. Okay, great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our YEG Housing Month speaker series. My name is Bernie Poitras. I'm the communication manager with Capital Region Housing, and I'll be your host for today. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. Your microphones will all be on mute. I'll introduce our speakers. We'll have 3 speakers today, 3 presenters, and they'll present for about 20 minutes. If you do have any questions in the Q&A portion of the presentation after the 20 minutes, please submit them via the chat room, or if you'd like to email them, I'll provide a link on the screen for the email for you to send it to that email address. We'll get to as many questions as we can, given the time we have. If we don't have time to answer your question, we will follow up. One of the presenters will follow up after today's session. Just a reminder that our hashtag is YEG Housing Month. So if you'd like to make a comment on today's session, please use that hashtag on your social media posts. YEG Housing Month is presented through a partnership of several organizations in Edmonton who offer housing and homeless serving supports in the city. We have 2 remaining sessions throughout the rest of November, so please visit housingmonth.ca for more information and to register for those 2 remaining sessions if you're interested. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers for our session, which is entitled New Directions in Community Housing Research. So we have 3 presenters today. Damian Collins, who's a professor of human geography at the University of Alberta and a director at Community Housing Canada. We also have Esther DeVos. She is the Director of Research, Policy, and Education with Capital Region Housing. And we also have Kenna McDowell, who is a research assistant in the Human Geography program at the University of Alberta. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Damian, who will start.
Thanks very much, Bernie, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for dropping into our session today. We'll keep things moving along at a good pace to make sure we wrap up in about 20 minutes and have time for questions. So I'm Damian Collins, and I'm the Director of Community Housing Canada, which is a research partnership. And the first thing you need to know is that the main partners are represented on today's call, myself and Kenna from the University of Alberta, and Esther from Capital Region Housing. And Capital Region is our main community partner in this exciting enterprise. And happy Movember to those of you who are celebrating Movember. Is celebrating the right word? I'm not sure. Next slide, please, Kenna. So all of us would be aware of the fundamental challenges facing the Canadian housing sector, and in particular that market housing often struggles to provide housing at rates that people on low and moderate incomes can afford. And so community housing has been recognised by the National Housing Strategy, or NHS, as the backbone of Canada's response to housing challenges, and in particular to the challenge of affordability. However, the community housing sector in Canada is not a single entity or a single network. Rather, it's a loose network of over 3,000 public and community-based organizations. And these vary widely in size, from organizations that have over 5,000 units to those that operate fewer than 20. So it's a very diverse sector, but it has a shared mission, which is the creation and operation of affordable housing. And a housing that sits outside of the normal market mechanisms in many cases. Together, this sector provides about 628,000 units across Canada and is home to about 4.3% of all households in Canada. So that's a relatively small proportion, fewer than 1 in 20 households. Certainly there are other high-income countries where there's a much higher rate of community housing provision. And one of the things that we're interested in with Community Housing Canada is what steps we can take to encourage and facilitate increasing the supply of non-profit, non-market housing across Canada. Next slide, please. So in the National Housing Strategy, which is a key document that we take our lead from, it talks in some length about community housing and the role it has to play. And it recognizes there are some challenges in the sector, challenges that have existed for a long time. Expiring operating agreements, particularly with the federal government, an aging housing stock with many buildings, for example, now approaching 40 or 50 years of age, and limited access to capital to build new units. And so there's some significant challenges on the supply side with community housing. And the National Housing Strategy sought to introduce a new era in which these challenges would be addressed with repair, renewal, and expansion of the sector. And so it includes funding to protect 385,000 units, which is a little over half of all of the total stock, and to create 50,000 new units. So this is this emphasis on increasing supply. And one of the things that's really interesting for me as an academic is that it situates this investment within a rights-based framework. And what that means, among other things, is that the community housing sector and other initiatives that are funded through the National Housing Strategy need to prioritize the needs of the most vulnerable Canadians. And later in today's talk, Kenna will be giving us an example of one group who is recognized as being vulnerable in Canada's housing system. Next slide, please, Kenna. Yeah, so I thought I'd talk a little bit about human rights just because I find it a very interesting and promising approach to thinking about housing. So both the National Housing Strategy in Canada, the National Housing Strategy Act that was passed in June last year, and international law recognize that housing is a basic human right. And one of the reasons that housing is a human right is because it's the basis for enjoyment of so many other rights in life: the right to health, the right to pursue an education, the right to work, the right to have an adequate standard of living. All of these things really depend upon having a home that is safe and affordable. However, we do know that the reality of Canada's housing system is that many households struggle to realise their right to housing. It's one thing to have a national housing strategy that recognises this right. It's another thing to have it implemented for all people. And what we see is that the non-profit sector, the community housing sector in Canada, is going to play a key role in ensuring that everyone has the right to safe, affordable housing, which is a fundamental promise of the National Housing Strategy. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in Community Housing Canada, we're a network of academics and community housing providers across Canada. We also have some international scholars who have joined us to give some international perspective. And our shared mission, so this is our mission statement, is to bolster the community housing sector's functions and capacity so that it can better meet the needs of the 1 in 8 Canadian households who require assistance in realising their right to housing. And so that 1 in 8 figure comes from the National Housing Survey, which found that about 12.5% of Canadians live in core housing need. And most commonly, as I suspect many of us are aware, the need which is most prominent is that of affordability. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over here to Esther, who's going to talk the next third of the presentation.
Thanks, Damian. So you heard Damian talk about our mission statement. So my part of the presentation is to sort of break it down in terms of how we're approaching it. So Community Housing Canada, that network of community partners and academics across Canada and internationally, are really focusing on community housing sustainability, which is one of the priority areas in the National Housing Strategy. And in particular, we're looking at the resilience of the sector, stabilizing operations, and also meeting the housing needs of Canadians. And like we said, it's a joint partnership. CMHC has really strongly encouraged the role of an incorporation and integration of community partners like Capital Region Housing, and there's some others that I know who are attending this session today, in Alberta at least, to be really involved and set the direction and work with the academics so that we have not just academic research coming out of these kinds of projects, but also reports and other sort of knowledge-based products that can really help the sector build their capacity, stabilize their operations, and create more resiliency. And we've just included our URL there if you're interested in finding out more about the project. Next slide, please, Kenna. So what we've done is, this is actually our sort of going into our second year of this network and this partnership. And the first year, we really sort of just met across the country with as many community partners and as many academics as we possibly could to really generate what we wanted to do in this 5-year project, which we're now sort of into year 1 for. And so we held cafes across a number of different regions in Canada, and really determined that there was 5 areas of inquiry that were really pertinent to looking at what is community housing sustainability. The first area is looking at community housing within a human rights framework. So you heard Damian speak to that. That's really sort of, because it's a rights-based framework and the NHS is moving that forward, that's a really key question because it's not been something that the community housing sector has had to deal with before. The second area of inquiry is looking to enhance building performance. So this is around design, energy efficiency, all of those kinds of things. So whether it's you're revitalizing a site, building a new site, or even just dealing with aging stock, is how can we really address the environmental and tenant needs when we're dealing with building performance. Next slide, please, Kenna. Our third area of inquiry is fostering social inclusion through community housing. And so one of the big things that has been recognized about affordable housing is that it really helps to promote social inclusion for those who are living in community housing. And so our specific question is there in terms of what does social inclusion look like? What does it mean for people? How do we measure it? And how do we integrate it within the community housing sector? Our fourth area of inquiry is understanding and evaluating the models of community housing. And this really goes to sustainability. We know as a sector across Canada that our current model is not as sustainable as it should be in terms of being able to add new units and meet the needs of those who are currently living in our housing. And so really sort of looking at the different models that we have of the different types of community housing. So that is everything from cooperative housing, not-for-profit housing, housing management bodies in Alberta, or housing organizations or associations. All of those sort of different models, permanent supportive housing. How do we find a model, whether it's a financial or governance model, that really helps to create more sustainability and resilience for the sector? Kenna, next slide, please. And then our last area of inquiry is looking to the future and sort of thinking about what community housing could look like. And in particular, we're talking about going forward in terms of sustainability. It's not enough to just think about the model. You also need to think about what it's going to be for the community and how it's going to work with the rest of the housing system. And so that's really what we're looking at. On top of the 5 areas of inquiry, one of the things that came up in all of our was looking at housing vulnerable Canadians and vulnerable Canadians, especially those who have been identified in the 35.
We're having a little bit of technical difficulty. We'll try and get her back.
Go ahead to the next one. There we go. Did I lose off for a minute?
Yeah, you're back.
Just for a second, but I can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. All right. One of the big things that we're focused on is making sure that the research is usable and accessible to the community housing sector. So it's not just an academic exercise, although they're taking the lead, they're the experts in research. So accessible research, making sure it's useful, but also developing really different products like report series and papers, which will be available for distribution to the community housing sector. And one of the other things that we're really committed to is encouraging students from across all disciplines to really participate and in our research, lead research projects themselves, and so that we can develop more housing scholars. And to that end, I'll now pass it on to Kenna, who is a great example of one of those students that is becoming a housing scholar. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Esther. So yeah, as discussed by Esther, the NHS has identified 12 different groups that experience vulnerability within the Canadian housing sector. And one of these groups is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and two-spirit people, or LGBTQ2 people. And this group is the focus of my research. And while the NHS does not explicitly address this, it is also important to note that the 12 groups they've identified aren't discrete and that they can and do overlap, and that these sites of overlap are important because this multiplicity of identity will affect the ways in which certain individuals navigate housing systems in Canada. So for example, 2 other groups identified as vulnerable by the NHS are seniors and youth. So the ways in which an LGBTQ2 senior and an LGBTQ2 youth navigate housing systems will be very different, and the way that they navigate these housing systems will be different than if a heterosexual youth or senior is navigating them. So oftentimes LGBTQ2 people are also discussed as though we are inherently vulnerable, which is not the case. So conceiving of LGBTQ2 people or any of the other groups identified by the NHS as inherently vulnerable limits our pathways out of housing vulnerability, and rather the vulnerability that LGBTQ2 people experience in housing ought to be discussed as a phenomenon that's created by systems of homo, bi, and transphobia, as well as failed housing policy. There we go. So in my research, I discovered that the primary sites of vulnerability for LGBTQ2 people in the Canadian housing sector are discrimination in both housing and employment, homelessness, which includes the inability to access temporary shelters, and mental health related issues, which include substance use disorders. So the ways in which these vulnerabilities are created by homo, bi, and transphobia, like I mentioned, become evident when we look at the lived experiences of LGBTQ2 people in housing. So let's look at a homelessness example, because this is the most extreme example of housing vulnerability. According to a study conducted in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, 15 to 40% of homeless youth identify as transgender or as non-heterosexual. And this is because LGBTQ2 youth experience multiple risk factors for homelessness at once, such as physical and sexual abuse, family conflict, and bullying. LGBTQ2 youth are also sometimes forced to flee their homes after they come out due to the threat of violence or to actual violence. And once homeless, it is difficult for many LGBTQ2 youth to access temporary shelter, again, due to violence that they experience within the shelter system. In addition, shelters are often segregated by gender, which can become problematic for trans and non-binary people. So as this example illustrates, the vulnerability we experience in the housing sector is often a direct result of systems like homo, bi, and transphobia. So as illustrated by the diagram on the slide, the vulnerabilities touched on above are created and exacerbated by a lack of stable housing. And at the same time, they make securing housing in the future more difficult. So for example, LGBTQ2 people are more likely to experience substance use disorders, depression and anxiety, and suicidal ideation than our heterosexual counterparts. And these issues can again be partially attributed to homo, bi, and transphobia, which have a negative psychological impact on LGBTQ2 people. And these existing mental health issues are worsened by the conditions of homelessness and housing precarity, while at the same time, mental health disorders make exiting homelessness and sustaining housing more difficult. Therefore, it is clear something must be done to interrupt the cycle of LGBTQ2 housing vulnerability, but what interventions are available? So human rights protections, both international and domestic, can be an effective intervention into LGBTQ2 housing vulnerability in certain instances. So various provincial human rights codes, such as those in Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, have made it illegal for landlords to discriminate against their tenants on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And the international right to housing guarantees all people security of tenure, which effectively prohibits discrimination against LGBTQ2 people in housing, as well as guarantees other things like accessibility and affordability. The Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights similarly prohibits discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity in basic services such as housing, healthcare, education, and employment. And as important as these protections are, they do not in themselves realize the right to housing for all LGBTQ2 people. Due to their relatively narrow focus on discrimination, these protections are sometimes unable to help LGBTQ2 people who may experience housing vulnerability that is unrelated to discrimination. Even the International Human Right to Housing, whose mandate extends beyond discrimination, does not oblige states to expand the housing stock where necessary, so LGBTQ2 people who may require specialized forms of housing, such as permanent supportive housing, for an example, are neglected. So while human rights protections are an important step in the realization of the right to housing, they can be inadequate on their own. And that's the end of my portion there. So then I think we'll move into the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Those are really good slides. Thanks for that presentation. I'll open up the virtual floor, the Q&A section. If you want to type in your questions into the Q&A, we'll have the presenters respond to your questions. If you want to send a question afterwards, I'll ask you to send it to communications@crhc.ca. So that's communications@crhc.ca. So yeah, go ahead and if you have any questions, attendees, just put them into the Q&A section. Presenters, can you see that question? Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I can. Thanks for your question, Rachel. So there are some groups like Rarica Now and Shades of Color that work with LGBTQ2 people to kind of just support them in accessing services such as housing, but I'm not really aware of like specific housing programs that are designed to serve LGBTQ2 people, but maybe Damian or Esther are aware of programs that I'm not aware of. Looks like maybe no, but yeah, Rarica Now and Shades of Color are two really good advocacy organizations in the city that do work with LGBTQ2 people.
Okay, and I see we have another question.
Esther, I wonder if you might be best placed to respond to Michael's question.
Sure, I'll happily answer that one. So the 4.3% of affordable housing is actually the number across Canada. And absolutely, we would want to see an increase in that number. And certainly that seems to be the intent of the National Housing Strategy. How much of an increase we'll see is still to be sort of undetermined. I think that's partly because of the balance in terms of protecting the existing stock and the aging housing stock. And so there's a lot of focus right now on just replacing a lot of aging stock. But certainly the demand is there for increased affordable housing options. And so hopefully we can start realizing that dream. So if you look at it compared to places in Europe, where they are a much more sizable sector and part of the overall housing system, that has come to be for many different reasons, largely also because a lot of those countries went through World War II and lost a lot of their housing as a result. And Canada's history is slightly different, but certainly we would want to see more than 4% across the country.
Okay, and we've got another question from Letitia there.
Hi, Letitia. I'll start by answering your question. And also just as a follow-up, Michael noted that CHU out of Isthmus at the Faculty of Education at the U of A supports queer youth in experiencing homelessness. So that's another great organization. Thank you, Michael. I'd totally forgotten about them. But back to Letitia's question, she asked, what are some issues seniors face in accessing housing, and what programs or services are available to house vulnerable seniors? So unfortunately, my knowledge of kind of the issues seniors face is limited to LGBTQ2 seniors, but a lot of the issues seniors face in accessing housing are related to low incomes or discrimination. So there's an organization in the United States called SAGE, which stands for Services and Advocacy for Gay Elders, I believe. And they have a program where they issue credentials to assisted living centers and other kinds of housing programs that house LGBTQ2 seniors to evaluate how inclusive they are. And there is also specific LGBTQ2 focused housing in the United States that seniors can access, that also reserve units specifically for seniors exiting homelessness, which also helps with the affordability issue. But yeah, hopefully that kind of begins to answer your question. But yeah, unfortunately, it's kind of, my experience is limited to LGBTQ2 seniors specifically.
So I can help Kenna and just speak a little bit more broadly to the seniors. In Edmonton, at least, we have a number of different seniors focused organizations that are housing management bodies, which is the type of organization created to deliver social and community housing. So Greater Edmonton Foundation is one of the largest with buildings across the city. There's also Vistas, Denis Pro is one of them. And so they usually have a much smaller number of buildings, but certainly Greater Edmonton Foundation or GEF is one of the main providers. And a lot of times what will happen is that there's sort of two categories of seniors housing. There's independent living, so self-contained units is the language that the province uses, and then lodges, which provides a lot more support and a degree more of assisted living. But in most cases, there's also some supports and activities that are involved, and regardless of the type of seniors housing that you're living with, just to create more of a community, a little bit different than other multifamily type housing.
Okay, we've got one from Miranda. Can we go
Miranda, can I just ask? Yeah, I'm just asking, are you asking specifically about the down payment assistance program that the home program used to provide? Because if you are, the reason why I'm asking is the home program, insofar as how it supported new homeownership with providing a down payment assistance, ended at the end of 2019. And so as far as I know, there is no other down payment assistance program in the city.
Okay, who would like to answer the question from Richard about tax incentives?
I can do that. There is a program called Cornerstones that the City of Edmonton has run that collaborates with landlords who would like to provide a secondary suite with an affordable rent. And it's like a 10-year commitment, and they can help with some of the costs for creating the secondary suite. But I don't know if there's ongoing tax incentives alongside of that. But certainly that's something to talk to the City of Edmonton about. The city has been really committed and really has a good process to get secondary suites if you compare it to other cities like the city of Calgary. So we have been moving in that direction, certainly. And Michael, just to your earlier question, sorry, I think we skipped over it, in terms of looking at neighborhood fit and attractiveness of buildings. We'll certainly see if we can go that far. A lot of the research, the level analysis is at the neighborhood level. So you're either talking about the building design itself or more of a neighborhood feel. So we're still in the early stages of setting the research programs for the next 5 years. So hopefully we can tackle that.
Okay, and I see Miranda clarified she's in Grand Prairie and she's talking about rental assistance. So any of you want to respond to that one too?
There is rent supplement programs across the country. You'll have to talk to the administrator of that in Grand Prairie, which I think is the Grand Prairie Spirit Foundation. I could be wrong on that one. and Capital Region Housing administers it for the city of Edmonton. And at this point, I don't know if there's any new rent subsidies being made available. But also at the end of the year, so it's hard to know until next year.
Okay, and another question, Jeanette asks, what's the name of the City of Edmonton program for secondary suites?
My recollection, it's Cornerstones. I could be wrong on that, but I know that was one of their programs for encouraging secondary suites and other programs for a while. I don't know if it's still in existence to the same extent as it was.
Okay, I'll keep the floor open. Do we have any more questions? Oh no, looks like we do. Justin from the GOA. So if one of the panelists can read that one, it's a long question. One of you can answer that one.
So yeah, a detailed question from Justin regarding what the right to housing looks like within a high-income country like Canada, and what difference has it made thus far. Great questions. I guess the National Housing Strategy is a rights-based strategy. And so this is the new framework that we're working with. And right from the very first sentences of the National Housing Strategy, it says that it's oriented around this rights-based approach. What does that look like in practice? I think it involves a couple of things. First of all, focusing on people who are vulnerable to being excluded from the housing sector. Secondly, addressing affordability challenges, but certainly it recognizes that the right to housing is a lot more than the right to shelter. And so, you know, an emergency shelter, for example, does not satisfy the right to housing. Equally, living in a home that's overcrowded or incredibly expensive or has insecure tenure does not meet the right to housing. And so I'd say what the right to housing does is it sets a standard to which we should aspire. It's a standard that will take quite a lot of work to get to, but nevertheless, it's useful in reminding us about what we want to achieve as a society and what is not acceptable about the status quo. So I think we are seeing some movement in that direction. And the investment that the federal government in particular is putting into housing across a diverse range of areas really does reflect the fact that they are beginning to take housing seriously as a human right. And there's something that involves much more than just a roof over one's head. It does need to be adequate and affordable and suitable as well, and secure, with secure tenure. So that's what I think it looks like in a high-income country like Canada, Justin.
Okay, thank you, Damian. I think in the interest of time, I think that's all the time we have for questions right now. It's about 10 to 1. So I want to thank the presenters for your great presentation today. I want to thank all the attendees. I think we had about, at peak, we had about 46, 47 attendees, so that's great to see. Again, if you do have a question that we couldn't get to today, please send it to communications@crhc.ca, and we'll make sure the question gets to the appropriate presenter to respond to you. So thank you again for attending. And don't forget, there's a couple of more sessions left in Edmonton Housing Month, YEG Housing Month. So please visit housingmonth.ca to view those sessions and register if you want to register for those. So again, thanks everybody for attending, and have a great afternoon.